to Unhoused and Unfiltered. It's so great to be back here. We're on episode number 3. How you doing, Sarah?
I'm doing great. The sun's out. It's Michigan. I'm going to enjoy it when I can.
Well, it might snow again tonight, but oh,
Shh, I did not need to hear that. I'm okay without knowing that.
at least we're hitting the warmer months, and it makes it nicer for everyone. And it's so great to be on this podcast talking to you about these issues that we're seeing come across, dealing with the unhoused population. We have got a following now on our
All right.
podcast. You said it was what, four
Well,
interns in our office. We're
that is
racking up
correct.
the likes, and it's no, it's great. I think
Only
it's
place to
been,
go is up.
yeah. No, it's been great that we've actually been able to talk about these issues that are facing the unhoused, and even the precariously housed. We know we have affordability crisis. We know we have an unhoused crisis. But one thing that I know we haven't talked about yet is why there are a lot of unhoused individuals or those that face housing insecurity. And I'm excited about the guest you brought on today.
Yeah, thanks. I've been privileged to know our guest, Johanna Kononen, for I probably longer than she wants to admit, couple decades. And as we talked about, my passion, particularly because of my own experience and because of the work I've done in poverty, is the ways in which we leave poor mothers behind and the ways in which we, tend to stereotype folks who are homeless as sort of this, you know, gendered male dude just you're scared of. And there's actually a lot of families who are living rough. And so today we're going to talk about how domestic and violence and sexual assault actually really is one of the key drivers for why women and their children are often homeless. And we have an expert today from the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness. Her name is Johanna Kononen. Like I said, I've had the privilege of knowing her for many years. She's an extraordinary attorney. She's an extraordinary human, and just is an incredibly intense advocate for battered women and children. I believe now she's the associate director of the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence, and I'm excited to welcome her. Welcome, Johanna.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, Nick. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Thanks for coming on, Johanna.
And just key little weird, everything in Michigan is a small town. Johanna and Nick actually went to high school together, but didn't figure that out until they started working again in a professional capacity, which is just how this world works.
We
Yep.
we
And
won't let
Sarah was my first ever boss when I
That is,
became a lawyer.
and we won't mention how many years ago we were in high school, Johanna.
or
It was
even
a
when we
long
were
time.
both baby lawyers, right?
Yep. Well, even longer than that.
Yep. Well, thank you so much. Can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and your background, and then a little bit about and then we'll talk a little bit more about the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence.
Yeah, of course. So again, thanks so much for having me. My name's Johanna Kononen. I am, as you said, Sarah, an associate director at the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. I am an attorney. I have been an attorney for 20 years now. I was like, oh, how long? A long time. And as I said, my very first ever job out of law school, Sarah was my supervisor, and I was working under a Violence Against Women Act grant where I was representing survivors of domestic violence in complex family law cases. And over the course of the last 20 years, I've kind of been in and out of legal aid and private practice, doing family law work and doing a lot of work and advocacy around domestic violence. I have now been at the coalition for 5 years, and I am excited to be here and to be able to do some kind of broader advocacy for programs that serve survivors of domestic and sexual violence and the survivors themselves. I also run a small legal clinic, the Survivor Law Clinic, which has a legal assistance for victims grant where we provide representation to survivors of sexual assault in Detroit.
Thank you, Hannah. And I remember, and this always stuck with me, one of your first things you said, I think even in your interview, because your background is as a nurse, also your undergrad, was
Mhm.
that domestic violence and sexual assault, you also look at it not specifically, of course, as the individual's needs, but also as the public health crisis. Can you talk a little bit about how sort of the statistics and how domestic violence sort of affects the whole of public health and systems in Michigan?
Sure. Short answer. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah,
Uh,
no
I
challenges.
was like, could you
Also,
give us?
if you could solve that for me too, that'd be
Oh,
great.
easy. If I was
And
queen for a
in
day.
no in no more than 4 sentences. So please just wrap it up real quick. So,
Uh, yeah, so I that is thinking about domestic and sexual violence as broader and impacting more people than just the two people who are in um, the violent situation, and realizing that that violence impacts the entire neighborhood and entire community, I think is um, kind of where I'm coming from when talking about domestic and sexual violence being both a public health crisis and a community safety and community viability crisis, right? Um, Domestic violence is a pattern of power and control, right? Exerted over in an intimate relationship, exerted with one person having more power and control against their partner, who, when you think of someone being a partner, you think of it being like a meeting of minds and there being some equality in that relationship. But when domestic violence is present, like the person who is perpetrating that is making a series of choices, right? And they are using as much power as they need to maintain control of the other person for whom they're supposed to care for, right? And be a partner with.
So that's an excellent point, and I think I want to tie that into why two questions because I probably threw you off. I just was remembered that you had this really incredible insight, but I also want to talk about. So, you see TV, it's like some sort of middle class lady who gets beat up and then like runs to the police, and then they maybe may or not believe her, but she has resources. But that's not really one, there's not always visible bruising from my understanding. And two, can you talk about how that pattern of power and control leads families into homelessness? Can you give us sort of an example or an understanding of why this is the leading cause of homelessness among women?
Yeah, of course. This is, as you stated, domestic violence is statistically speaking the number one cause of homelessness for women and children. And but that's not the way that people themselves usually talk about it, right? They People focus on oftentimes on their economic situation, right? Or that they didn't have choices, right? And really what we're talking about is like a lot of kind of intertwined and interlocking like vulnerabilities for people who are trying to leave an abusive or domestic violence relationship, and they have very limited options. Something that I know you and I have talked about before, and that comes up a lot, is it oftentimes takes, 7 times for someone to leave a relationship, 7 attempts before it sticks.
Now, why is that? No,
And
I think that's the first critical things people are going to ask me is like if somebody hit me, why I think I'd be out of there. Why doesn't
yeah,
she just leave?
I hear that all the time also. Why doesn't she just leave? And I think that a lot of times when people are thinking about domestic violence and sexual assault, they are really go into kind of self-protection mode, right? People like to get themselves as far away from that experience as possible. And so they try to, well, I wouldn't do that, right? And so it makes people feel safe because they wouldn't make that choice. But really, it's very hard to put yourself in someone's shoes. What led you here today, Sarah, what led you here today, Nick, and what led me here today are very different experiences. There were parts of that journey that were easy for me that might have been hard for you, and vice versa. And so, something that we talk about a lot is how each person is the expert of their own situation, right? That person knows their partner, their spouse, or their romantic partner better than I ever will. And so they also know what they're capable of. And usually they're right. So
So it's dangerous.
it's very dangerous. Usually that's really one of the highest risks for lethality is when someone is leaving a relationship with domestic violence.
So that's when you see these like love gone bad headlines in the it's really a domestic violence where maybe she was trying to leave or assert independence, right?
Yes. And, domestic violence, like you said, a lot of times people are really thinking about the Law and Order or the TV show
Yeah,
or the
that's what
movie
I think.
version
Boom, boom.
where
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
a sad lady gets beat up by her husband and then someone comes and saves the day for her. But or as I like make this joke, which I know that you've heard, Sarah, because when people talk about who does this type of work and who is helping serve survivors of domestic sexual violence, there's like a stereotype that it's like nice ladies helping sad ladies.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And really that's very minimizing of like the important work that people are doing and the like crisis advocacy and like the crisis support that people are coming to domestic violence shelters, really fleeing like both of those things, fleeing
Sometimes
domestic
with,
violence and the possibility of homelessness.
and sometimes it's just the clothes on their back, right?
Hmm.
And
Exactly.
then sometimes it's my understanding victims are not allowed to work or they have had or the perpetrator destabilizes their work after a separation. Domestic violence is not just the violence, right? It's the control around what money you've had, what skills you've had. So it's entirely possible that the perpetrator partner has more resources than
Well,
the
that's
victim.
actually something that we see often. Is again, people think of physical violence as the thing that they want to avoid and the thing that they think of most, but really that economic abuse and control of finances and the um, microscope under which a lot of survivors are living in their homes, like not being able to make any financial decisions on their own or having access to bank accounts, or being monitored very, very, very closely. So they feel like they can't take out extra money. They can't make any purchase without it causing a problem in their home. And so when people flee or, go to a domestic violence or a homeless shelter seeking safety, um, like you said, they don't have a lot of resources with them and they don't know how to access the resources that might exist within their own home.
So I think most people are like, yeah, but domestic violence is a crime. Isn't like the cops going to arrest him, put him in jail, or a family court going to give her some money if they're married? Like, isn't that how that works? Like somebody's going to make it right? Or, how does this end? How do these folks end up, living in a car?
Well, there are a lot of people that don't want to get the police involved. Um, and there are a myriad of reasons for that, including their own safety and also the stigma that comes with, disclosing that you are a victim of domestic violence. People don't feel safe telling that. And statistically, law enforcement is filled with many people who are perpetrators of domestic violence. And so sometimes people are worried about the response that they'll get. And while some abusive actions are a crime, right? The physical violence, many things that are abusive are not a crime. And they can still support a perpetrator maintaining that control in the relationship.
Well, and I know I'm a lawyer, you're a lawyer. The first domestic violence is normally a 93-day misdemeanor, right? Too. So there's no guarantee the perpetrator's going to jail for any real length of time. And I guess and then my follow-up question is, we've both been in family law. That is not a quick fix to your economic challenges. If you need
It,
money and you're in the shelter and you got 3 kids, it's not family court that's going to get you out of the domestic violence shelter, right?
no, because, when you have let's imagine that these two people are married and you have children together. There's a minimum of 6 months that's going to take. And in my experience, representing survivors, it almost always takes almost a year for a divorce to go through the entire process and get an order. And at that point, people are exhausted, right? A perpetrator might be hiding money,
Well, and
might have transferred things into other names. Yeah,
and you can only stay in shelter like 90 days. So that's not
exactly.
your solution. So what I'm kind of getting at is it makes sense to me that you're fleeing this really difficult situation. You end up maybe you have a job, as a waitress or whatever. You married and you're in shelter, and then it makes sense to me that suddenly like you have nowhere to go, right? You have
Mhm.
no
Well, people don't have options. Like I mentioned earlier, that it oftentimes takes 7 attempts for someone to leave. But I read something about this that really stuck with me that was, but when people leave or are in an abusive situation, their friends and family kind of give up on them after about 3 attempts.
yeah.
They're like, I'm over this. I can't believe you keep going back to this guy. Like this is a choice that you're making, like this is on you.
And
And
the
so people
perpetrator
are
works on
often
that, right? Like he's trying to
isolated.
isolate him. Yeah.
Yeah, they're very isolated, and that's a tactic of perpetrators that they isolate people from their friends and family, that they're the only one who cares about them. And then, like you said, when someone has kids and they are facing a time limited stay in a shelter or getting assistance, um, oftentimes people will choose the devil over the
Right.
devil you don't. And so they will either go back because they have kids and they don't want their kids to be experiencing homelessness, or they'll couch surf, or they'll do a lot of other things that people don't necessarily classify as, you know, or think of right away when thinking about homelessness. Um, People living in their car, or and using the gym for the shelter, or couch surfing. And it's not always like the person that you see on the street, like that you mentioned previously, like the stereotype of a homeless person.
Well, and I imagine, both of us are moms, like all the expenses that come with being a parent, too. Like, I don't know, I just paid some money for my kid to go somewhere. I don't even know what I just wrote a check for. Like, I imagine that's hard to give your kids the life that you want for them if you're living in the shelter, right?
Yeah, and people often think of it as a kind of they are sacrificing their safety for the safety of their kids. And also, there are many parents and many moms who will stay in an abusive situation because they know that the perpetrator is going to end up with parenting time of those kids, and they would rather be there to see what is happening, to keep the kids safe, to be the one taking the brunt of that person's anger and frustration. And so, these aren't choices that people are making because they have, every option under the sun. People are making the best choice for themselves to stay safe and alive in a set of really crappy circumstances, usually.
So, in terms of how common this is, what are the statistics around domestic violence in relationships for women and men and folks who are in LGBTQ relationships? Do you have any sense of how common the it is? I mean, it's my guess that it's not as uncommon as we think it is.
Yeah, you're right. I think the statistics are held by the CDC, right? The Center for Disease Control has said that approximately 1 in 4 women And 1 in 4 men will experience physical violence by their intimate partner at some point during their life. And there and it's even more prevalent that those folks, those, same groups, women and men, will experience some sort of sexual violence in their lifetime. And again, that doesn't speak to how common other types of abuse are, including emotional abuse, verbal abuse, economic abuse, that aren't categorized in such a clear-cut way. It's even more common for people to experience this. Something that I like to think about, again, people always want to kind of take a step back from thinking about domestic and sexual violence because they don't want to think that it's happening to them or their families. But really, wherever there is a group of people, there are survivors in that group. And so it's important to remember, like, there are people who are going through something that they might never disclose it to you.
So, and I should be clear. I mean, I've been using gendered language because historically, like it was like the year I was born that that women got to have credit, right? So historically, women haven't had the same right to go to the police, but it does affect sexual violence, particularly, does affect men and women, and can affect folks who being homeless because of that sort of ripple in their pond, right? Of whether it's a man or a woman, it can affect both genders. That's correct?
Yes, absolutely. And I have used the same gendered language as you just because statistically speaking, it is more prevalent. But the domestic violence and sexual violence is also something that happens in the LGBTQ plus community. You know, uh, I think research says approximately a quarter to a half of LGBTQ people will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. So this is something that impacts everyone. I think that's something that I would like everyone to know, right? This is not something that happens to other people. This happens to people even if they haven't told you about it.
And it's a pattern of power control. It's a choice. So when people ask, like, what happened to make this person be a perpetrator, it's they're choosing because some humans want power over other humans, right? That's sort of the underlying, and they use these tactics to control and harm their partner.
And I think it's important to differentiate though, like something that I just heard in a community meeting that I was in the other day. Um, People again will be like, well, they're just fighting. Or
Right.
or sometimes this is just like they're always at each other. And there's a difference between a toxic relationship that isn't good for either person and one where there is domestic violence and a pattern and a choice to exert power and control over the other partner.
And in the domestic violence, um, one partner's using all of these tactics as a way to control and undermine the other partner. So, going back to the economics, it's another reason why that victimized partner just maybe doesn't have the resources and are more likely to end up being homeless.
Exactly.
If it's okay, let's switch because I also know you're an expert in sexual violence. You run a clinic specifically to support victims of sexual violence. And it's sort of a fairly new area, but I certainly know, and Nick can probably jump in here, because he does direct work with folks in camps, that sexual violence happens both before as a reason to get as a reason people are homeless, and then also during being homeless. Nick, do you have anything you want to?
Yeah, it's something I've seen repeatedly when I go out to an encampment. A person's like, please don't use my real name. My partner knows where I'm at. I don't want them to know where I'm at. I don't want them to know who I'm talking to. I don't want. Then you say, well, have you gone to the shelter? Well, they know where the shelters are. They'd be looking for me. Or you say things like, well, do you want to talk to the police? I don't trust the police, or I'm afraid they'll talk to my partner and they'll find out where I'm at. So I mean, you are exactly correct. I mean, we see it. We see a large number of people that have had both sexual violence and domestic violence against them, both men, women, and the LGBTQ plus community.
Well, I think it's important we emphasize that because we don't talk enough about men who are victims of sexual assault, that the trauma for both genders, but particularly because we do not have a conversation about men's sexuality particularly well, is another co-occurring reason that folks struggle after a sexual assault. Victimization, maybe can't hold their job, maybe start using drugs or alcohol to deal with the pain. What is your experience, with your clients, in seeing that kind of spiral or how a sexual assault can affect someone's life and how they may end up, on the street or living in the car because of having been violated?
Yeah. Something that you both touched on, like that people don't want to remain anonymous, right? They don't want to flag themselves as a victim. Oftentimes, in the domestic and sexual violence kind of world, oftentimes we say survivor a lot of the time. But and that's like trying to empower people that this is something they've lived through, but not everyone likes that, right? And people don't like, oftentimes there are people who don't like to think of themselves as a victim, and they don't anticipate a supportive reception from people that they would disclose to. And when people are vulnerable, right, and have been victimized, they oftentimes are, kind of go into self-protective mode. And like you said, there are a lot of people who feel safer being in their car than going to a shelter, right? They feel like they can then have some control and some power, like in choosing the situation, and they know what to expect there. They know places that they can go. But there are a lot of people who feel safer in that situation. And when sexual assault is wildly underreported, right? People, we talk about, not blaming the victim, but unfortunately, the way that an investigation of a sexual assault often goes feels very much like the victim is getting blamed. They're getting intensely questioned. Why did they go where they did? Why did they wear what they did? Did they lead this person on? And oftentimes people know what happened to them, and they don't want to get into a he said, she said, um, and have, kind of their life under a microscope, in order to get what a lot of times in society we think should happen, like, right? Law and Order SVU. It's been
That's
on for,
correct. Um,
and that makes it seem like they're gonna get the bad guy. They're gonna tell you that it wasn't your fault and that it's okay. And unfortunately, that's not the experience of most survivors of sexual violence.
well, and I want to be respectful of your time, but I do know you've done a lot of work about that. On, how long it takes to litigate or prosecute a sexual assault case, as well as the conviction rates are pretty low, right?
Very. Um, conviction rates are low, and for sexual assault, like oftentimes we talk about, like colloquially we all say rape, right? But like Michigan law does not use the word rape. It's criminal sexual conduct. Um, and the people have a hard time kind of wrapping their mind around that, because they're like, if it's so bad, everyone would see that. And then the bad guy would go to jail. And
Well,
unfortunately, like I said previously, it's a very underreported. The Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, RAIN, I think has reported that for every 1,000 sexual assaults, only 50 are reported to law
wow.
enforcement that lead to an arrest, and with only 28 out of 1,000 leading to a felony conviction.
Wow. And I guess we're seeing that also, I mean, uh, in the national news, whatever side of the aisle you're on, we certainly know that they could have arrested and prosecuted Epstein much earlier. When they did arrest and prosecute him, he got a sweetheart deal. All of those things make victims lose,
Well,
you
and
know,
in the news of just the last week here in Metro Detroit, an ex-Detroit police sergeant has been accused and charged with being a serial rapist. Um,
Yeah,
so
so if you can't go to the police, where are you going to go?
yeah.
Right?
And so, where are you going to go? Hopefully, you're going to seek the services of your local domestic and sexual violence service provider, who is going to hopefully provide you with, non-judgmental support, the type of support that you need. Like there aren't any requirements for getting those services.
Hey,
So,
Johanna, if
oh, go
if
ahead.
I'm somebody that's experiencing sexual or domestic violence, how do I know to find where do I go to find these shelters, or how do I connect to a domestic violence provider? You know, because again, they're fleeing, they're trying to figure out where to go next, and they may have kids, but where do they start?
So that's a great question, Nick. So I think that this sometimes there are agencies that are more familiar in each community, right? But every county in Michigan has domestic and sexual violence providers that serve them. The coalition where I work does operate the Michigan's statewide domestic sexual violence and human trafficking hotline. And we can refer um, people to their local shelter, to their local service provider. So if you don't know where to start, you can start by calling the hotline, which is anonymous and confidential. So if someone just wants to call and have a supportive, trained person to listen to them, they can. The number is 855 um, 864 2374, which I believe, if you're spelling it, goes to Voices for.
And you can also go to mcdsv.org, correct?
Yes,
We sort of jumped in, but the Michigan Coalition to Attend Domestic Violence, I know, is a statewide. You represent all of these folks in the local community, and you have connections with all of them. Your statewide advocacy training
yes,
agency, a nonprofit. So going to their website will give you a lot of good resources, correct? To be
yes.
able to research folks in your community. You've given us a lot to really think about, Johanna. Is there anything, if you want to add, you want to add, or if you wanted folks to know one thing, um, about the interrelationship between domestic violence and sexual assault and homelessness, or how they can help, um, what would it be?
Well, I think that each of us is closer to experiencing um, the dual traumas of domestic violence and homelessness than we would like to admit. And so be gracious to your neighbors and community members, and please support your local homelessness service provider and domestic and sexual violence service provider. They are wonderful people who are trying to help in an environment that is not currently favorable to helpers.
We appreciate everything you do and your dedication to making things better for folks. And thank you again for being willing to join us today.
Oh, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Johanna.
Wow, Nick, that was kind of a lot. I know you talked a little bit about what you're seeing in the camps, but I'd love to hear more. I know we've been seeing, you've mentioned you've seen young mothers and victims of violence. If you could just sort of put a human face on sort of all that information that Johanna gave us, I would be great.
Yeah, it's so heartbreaking when you go into an encampment, and we mentioned this before. There's 33,000 unhoused individuals in the state of Michigan. There's 33,000 stories, and you go into an encampment, you see a young woman there. I've seen young men, uh, and you start talking to them, and you're engaging in this conversation, and they seem very worldly, or they seem to come from, you know, away from that what people stereotypically see as a homeless individual, that the scary man that hangs out, to being this bright, wonderful person, and comes to find out they're running away from a domestic violence or sexual violence. You ask them, why are you here? Why don't you go why don't you go talk to somebody? And they say, last time I did, my attacker found me, or my boyfriend found me, or my girlfriend. In a lot of cases for the young men, they're part of the LGBTQ community. They don't have the family network either to support them, and it's scary. Who do you go to? And you start talking to them, and you start hearing their story, and it's so heartbreaking that they endured, multiple attempts of leaving. They've they don't know where to start. They've tried going to a shelter, but maybe they don't quite fit the shelter's capacity. They don't know how to get to the domestic or sexual violence shelter. It's just a whole host of issues, and it's heartbreaking. It's true. I mean, there are a lot of people out there, and we do see when you see somebody with a young child. First thing you want to know is why are they there, and those conversations become real right away.
So one of the things because we've talked about this before, but we are really pushing the legislature because there's been cuts to street outreach, and street outreach is where you go and what you do, and you sit with someone because you really can't understand that person's experience, right? And then you sit with them, you get a sense of what they need, and then you help craft a plan to get them there. And so I know that some of the work I did was with LGBTQ youth, and you go where folks are. So I went to lots of LGBTQ youth have to engage in sex work to survive or stripping to survive because they've been kicked out from their families. There's no place for them to go, and they've got to eat. They're very young and often taken advantage of by predators who are looking for folks and kids who are vulnerable. And I know it was heartbreaking to sit with them, but what was really important is funding to connect because then I could get them into shelter and provide the supports they need. Um, can you talk a little bit legislatively about sort of why we need this money and how it's been underfunded?
Yeah, I mean, street outreach. Everybody wants to not see homeless individuals on the street. I mean, for different reasons. For us, we see it as a dignity. They deserve housing as a human right. For those in some communities, they just don't want to see it on their streets. So people want to get into housing. So there's a lot of investment in housing. But as you have alluded to, we don't have a lot of trauma informed care. And people don't go into housing for those reasons. And so the street outreach allows individuals to go out there, meet people where they're living, and hear their story and find the best wraparound services for that individual. You know, one thing I
So
didn't
it's
know until I started working in this job was there's a difference between category one homelessness and category four homelessness.
Yeah.
You and I have had this conversation since I started this role. Is Cat one homeless is true what everybody understands as homelessness, and in the state of Michigan they can get a free state ID and a free birth certificate if they don't have those documents. Category four homelessness is if they're a documented survivor of domestic or sexual violence, they aren't entitled to that free ID or that
which, which makes
which
no
or free
sense.
birth certificate.
Could be living exactly the same, could just different type of shelter.
Right.
I think it's really also important to sort of put this in context. I know that some of these grants to just do a street outreach are like $25,000 for Ingham County, like which makes no sense, right? Like you can't, they're already underserved, and so we need more money and they're being cut. I would also add, when you said folks are, they're not ready to go into housing. That's the housing with supports part of housing first, right?
Yeah.
We can't just put people in housing. We need supports. And I think that's the part of housing first that people misunderstand. And so street outreach is a huge part of housing first.
Yeah, and there's even there's stories of people not wanting to leave their abusive situation because of pets, and you can't take a pet into a shelter. So there's all kinds of reasons people are still choosing to remain on the street. And I do like the response of Johanna, where she said uh, some of them are some of the unhoused individuals are sleeping in cars because they can control where that car goes, or they can get away quicker. And I think that speaks volumes of the system and the trauma informed care that is needed. If you told somebody to go into a domestic violence shelter or just a general population shelter, they're going to be a little leery, especially if that abuser has tracked them down before.
Well, and if we replicate the same kind of control, I'll also say, and I know I did this, and lots of folks in the domestic violence and homelessness folks have done that. I was really grateful to get community support to start a project and create a kennel so that you could house your pets on site. That's the ultimate trauma-informed care. And I
Right.
know that for most of our homeless folks, we barely we have people sleeping in chairs so they don't freeze to death. We certainly aren't thinking about their pets. But folks who are listening at home, think about your cat or your dog. Are you going to surrender them if that's been your only friend, and your only support system throughout a horrible relationship, throughout violence, and sleeping on the street? Or are you going to choose to take your dog in your car?
Yeah. No, you bring up a great point, Sarah. And, I think we all have to take a step back and see these 33,000 stories,
Yeah,
and understand them, and show empathy. And I think one of the important things is with street outreach, we get more people out on the street. We connect people where the unhoused individuals are living. We can connect them to resources. We can understand the trauma informed care that is needed in that community to assist those that are in encampments or just living in their cars. Um, and especially families, this is a tough situation to be in. And we have the McKinney-Vento supports
right.
at the local school districts. And I don't think a lot of people understand the utility of that program and how they can connect people to resources also.
Oh, it's an incredibly spectacular program. Um, and our school districts do an amazing job implementing it. It just puts more emphasis on schools, right, that are already struggling with some of these
Yeah.
significant issues. I know we're coming to the end of our time, but I do want to put all this in perspective. I think you mentioned that the state of Michigan right now commits just $4 million overall to homelessness. Is that correct?
That's out of the general fund, yes, to the emergency shelter program, and about $14 million TANF to the emergency shelter program. And that's not a whole lot of money.
No, and that's for at risk of being considered, yet another tax and spend liberal. I am asking for a practical investment in these things that work when we are making not much of an investment right now.
Yeah, I mean, street outreach would have a huge impact. It would be able to connect people, identify needs in communities, and prepare communities for what is needed, inform leaders in communities. So this street outreach is the first point of contact for many unhoused individuals.
Well, Nick, I really appreciate this segment, and we'll continue to talk about some of these issues and how they affect folks. I know we're also looking for guests who can talk directly about their experiences, so I'm hoping folks will stay tuned. I just want to make sure Nick gets the final word because he's entitled to that, for his leadership. So, Nick, I'm going to turn
No,
the remainder up for to you.
well, no, thanks, Sarah. That's a great handoff. Appreciate it. But no, I think we've been having some great conversations in these podcasts. I look forward to where we're going on these. I know we have a lot of interest from different service providers and different people in the community. I'm real excited to talk about these issues and get the word out, because we as Michiganders can do better. We can connect people to resources,
As
and
well
we
as
need.
Michiganians. Yep.
Yeah, we always have to get that one in,
Yeah, I did.
and then also just show empathy towards our fellow human being and and show dignity because housing is a human right. Um, and the more people we have housed, the more stable our state is, the more stable our economy is, and the further we'll move along.
And these is our community and our neighbors, right? So rock on. We need to continue to
Yep.
help each other. Well, thank
Well,
you.
thanks, Sarah, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Talk soon.